Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
The Prime Minister did not miss out on a little Europe time this summer. Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and Latvia were all on the agenda. A business trip in a busy political summer. There were big project announcements, tariff redo, and a by-election that will send the leader of the opposition back to the House of Commons. So with Parliament set to resume in a couple of weeks, our National Affairs panel is here to dig in. Kathleen Petty is the host of the West of Centre podcast and Alberta at Noon. Aaron Wherry is a senior reporter in CBC's Parliamentary Bureau, and Ryan Tumilty is a political reporter at the Toronto Star. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Susan.
Aaron, let's start with you and Mark Carney's trip to Eurus. Remind us who he met with and what he was trying to accomplish there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple things. First was the trip to Ukraine, which, I think is more sort of symbolic and sending a message of support there. And, given the negotiations or peace talks or however you want to typify it, I think, there was probably a need for Canada to sort of, again, signal its support for Ukraine. The larger piece of the trip, of course, was trying to connect with other countries and continue, I think, Mark Carney's efforts to, not necessarily align us with Europe, but to sort of draw stronger connections, I think, between Canada and Europe. I don't think you saw, major breakthroughs and huge progress necessarily on diversifying Canada's trade, but I think it's going to take multiple trips back and forth to Europe, I think, to really kind of get at that larger issue of trade diversification.
Ryan, let's stick with the military aspect of the trip for a second. It's become more and more clear how much money Canada is going to be spending in the years ahead on that. What do you make of the Prime Minister's focus on the military?
Yeah, I mean, I think that firstly is a reflection of where we are internationally, right? The rules-based international order that we've always talked about is breaking down. We are seeing large countries target each other, Russia and Ukraine obviously being the biggest example of that. But I think there's plenty of concern about China and Taiwan, and plenty of concern that America is not going to play the role it once did. What I notice is not just the way that the money is being put on the table, but that they seem to be moving pretty quickly. The Trudeau government last year first started talking about replacement subs. We now have two companies shortlisted, and apparently they're going to make an announcement next year. That doesn't seem fast, I know, for people who've purchased things, but making such a big commitment as quick as the Carney government seems to be intent on making it is actually very quick for Canadian defense procurement.
Interesting. And Kathleen, when we're talking about speed, Mark Carney was also talking about speeding up, changing the kind of trade we do with Europe. And, for example, building LNG ports in Churchill, expanding the Montreal port. It's part of what he calls his nation-building plan. What about the reaction in Alberta on the focus on LNG rather than oil and gas?
Well, Brian Jean, who is the energy minister in Alberta, Susan, actually was very supportive and lauded the intention to expand LNG markets. Alberta has a lot of natural gas, so we definitely see the opportunity from the government's point of view here. But clearly, oil and gas, generally speaking, and oil pipelines remain the priority. And there is an expectation still that there is an opportunity for a pipeline to Prince Rupert. There's also a lot of talk, and the CEO of Trans Mountain was talking about this, advocating for expanding the TMX further as the first option to expand and create capacity for oil. But Tim Hodgson interestingly said he actually doesn't think that that's a project in the national interest. He thinks it might be worthwhile and maybe it'll go ahead, but that isn't what he's talking about. Whereas Alberta's talking about both. They want that and a pipeline, and they want to see, some opportunity in Churchill. And of course, the government is talking very sort of glowingly about that. But I would say for Alberta, it's the western route that they're most interested in.
Right. And Aaron, let me bring you in on this and ask you about how does that set the stage for competing interests of the provinces as they all jockey for some of this big budget spending that the Prime Minister has in mind on these projects?
Yeah, I think the test was always going to be, when it comes right down to which projects are being proposed and the federal government has to start making choices about who it's going to get behind, what it's going to approve. How is this all going to fit together? The conversation between the Prime Minister and the Premiers has been remarkably cordial till now. But can he manage to keep everyone on board when he starts making choices about projects, I think remains to be seen, especially because, an issue like a pipeline, for instance, particularly one going through British Columbia, isn't necessarily going to be embraced by British Columbia.
Let alone Quebec, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think the major projects office that in the body within government that's going to sort of oversee this, we're expecting to see that sort of move forward probably as early as today. And I think that is sort of the next step before we get to actual projects. But, I think the Prime Minister's focus on ports, I think, is interesting in the sense of trade diversification. I think it's also interesting in the sense that of all the projects you could approve that might be uncontroversial, that's probably at the top of the list. And I think the harder discussions about pipelines and how these projects are sort of dispersed across provincial interests and provinces, I think that's the real kind of hard conversation that's pretty clearly on the horizon at this point.
Ryan, all of this focus on Europe, big projects, new partnerships is in reaction to the situation, the crisis that Canada is facing vis-a-vis trade with the United States. What has Mark Carney been able to do or not do so far on that crisis this summer?
I mean, so far, not much. Obviously, there's never a deal until there is one. So it's possible one will be announced tomorrow and I'll have egg on my face. But he hasn't really made a huge amount of progress on a deal that we know of with the U.S. So far, all we've seen is him back away from some things, make some concessions. We haven't seen any concessions from the U.S. So it'll be interesting to see. But if he's accomplished anything, he's managed to keep Trump talking. Which can be a win in its own regard. And he has managed to protect a lot of Canada's trade that's covered by the CUSMA agreement.
Let's play a little of what Prime Minister Carney said about his decision to back away from the retaliatory tariffs.
So as we work to address outstanding trade issues with the United States, we will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under CUSMA.
We want to be very good to Canada. I like Carney a lot. I think he's a good person. And he's removing his retaliatory tariffs, which I thought was nice.
So, Ryan, just to finish up your thoughts on this, what about the politics of this? How is that playing for the Liberals? Looking like a backtrack or looking like a good negotiating strategy?
I think the politics in Canada, I think we don't yet know. He only made those decisions last week. Certainly, I'm sure he'd rather have not walked back without a deal, but you have to deal with the situation you have. What I think is interesting is that those tariffs were meant to hit the politics of the U.S., right? We were hitting Kentucky bourbon and Florida orange juice in the hope that politicians in those states, Republican politicians, would pressure Trump and would be on Canada's side. And I think what we saw perhaps this summer is that there is no pressuring Trump on this file. He's not going to listen to reason. He's not going to listen to economists, and he's not going to listen to politicians, even in his own party, about backing away on these trade files, which is why most of the deals we've seen have been pretty punitive with, Europe and things like that. There is a new template for deals with the U.S. and it's not on a win-win conversation. It's definitely a trade deal on the U.S.'s terms.
Kathleen, give us the perspective from Western Canada on this whole thing, on how the Prime Minister changed his tune and what that does to the all singing from the same songbook among the provincial leaders.
Well, Premier Danielle Smith applauded the move. She thought it was the right move. She would argue that was always her position, and he's now essentially doing what she was arguing for in the first place. So it was, better late than never. But, I think part of it, too, is that the criticism is that a lot of what the Prime Minister has done is seen as reactive, right? Cancelling the digital services tax was a reaction to sort of very vocal criticism about how the negotiations were going. And that was especially true with repealing the reciprocal tariffs, which is why, critics have referred to that and tried to characterize that as capitulation, notwithstanding Smith applauding it, nevertheless emphasizing that she felt that they shouldn't have been put in place in the first place. And the argument being that be proactive instead. In other words, when when Donald Trump decided to exempt CUSMA-compliant products, outside of the sectoral tariffs, but the rest of it, that was the time when Canada should have done the same, should have reciprocated. Instead, the tariffs stayed in place until there was very vocal criticism, most especially from the U.S. ambassador to Canada.
Aaron, how are the Conservatives dealing with this change from Mark Carney?
Well, I think it's opened up the field for them to attack the Prime Minister. You heard that from Poilievre pretty clearly, referring to it as capitulation and elbows down. And this isn't, the Carney that we heard during the campaign. And I think, that is fair play. I think, the problem, of course, in these situations is we don't know what's sort of being negotiated behind closed doors. We don't know, what demands the White House is making or what, Canada is saying yes or no to. I think, it does up the pressure on Carney to, both land a deal and defend it as the best possible deal that he could have got. I think, further to Ryan's point, if you go back to, the first NAFTA renegotiation under Justin Trudeau, there was a real effort by the Canadian government to pressure Congress, to pressure states, to pressure American businesses, and sort of enlist them in the cause of fighting for free trade between Canada and the United States. And I think you just don't see that pressure being exerted on the White House anymore. You don't hear sort of complaints about what the president is doing. And I think that speaks to, the fact that we're sort of dealing with a different set of circumstances, a different, it's the same president, but I think it's operating in a different situation. And I think that changes the calculus on what kind of deal we're going to get. But I think I think that is going to be part of, can Mark Carney sell to the Canadian public that he got the best deal possible?
And Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney will be facing off in the House in this new dynamic after Poilievre won the by-election in the Alberta riding of Battle River Crowfoot. This week, he was attacking the Prime Minister on something different than trade. Let's listen to that.
Here we are today. Mark Carney is bringing back the carbon tax to Carbon Tax 2.0. He calls it the Clean Fuel Standard, Clean Fuel Regulations. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, it will add 17 cents a litre to your gas. What did the last carbon tax add to your gas? 17 cents a litre.
So, Kathleen, the carbon tax is back in the national conversation as we really look forward to a major budget, the first budget of Mark Carney, which will come down within months.
Well, it's interesting as I listened to that, I think Pierre Poilievre is hoping lightning strikes twice, right, with carbon tax 2.0. But I do think the bigger conversation when the House comes back will be a number of things. Obviously, content, right, the substance of it. There is an element, there's a lot of grace being given to Mark Carney. But now I think we're getting close to the point where Canadians are going to say, show me your work, show me something. We know that the job market is flatlining. The trade war is really starting to have an impact on individuals and their jobs. It's starting to be felt. And then there's the whole back and forth, like what is that relationship in the House going to be like? We know that Pierre Poilievre is emotive and additionally combative. Carney's demeanor is so different, right? Kind of clinical. And the contrast is going to be fascinating to watch and to see whether Pierre Poilievre adjusts his demeanor in response. But I'll be looking to see the extent to which he's focusing on the relationship with the United States. Because you've got to be careful there, Susan, right? He's walking a bit of a tightrope. It's absolutely legitimate to criticize how trade negotiations are going to the extent that we even know, to be frank. But you do run the risk of that criticism looking like you see failure as a political cudgel that you can use. And so part of this, carbon tax 2.0 and presumably other criticisms we're going to be hearing will be very much focused on the economy and in anticipation of the budget.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the budget, Ryan. If it's an opportunity for the Prime Minister to use an expression, put his money where his mouth has been, what are we expecting there?
Yeah, I mean, I will be very curious to see what comes of this budget. The Carney government has made, part of their brand that they're moving quickly. He has stressed repeatedly over and over again that this country needs to move quickly to respond to Trump, to respond to changing global circumstances. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how much of that agenda gets implemented in the budget, because that's how governments move things forward. That budget document is the absolute blueprint for any federal government on how they move forward. So, he waited till October, didn't bring one in the spring after the election. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in what that budget looks like and how it moves this government forward. Does it, set up everything that they promised? Does it leave a lot to details? We saw during, the Trudeau government, especially I would say in the last 3 or 4 years, they would have these announcements and then, maybe 6 months later it would be in the budget, but not all the details were there. And, some of these tax credits would take a year or a year and a half to actually come into force. If Carney approaches things the same way, I think he's definitely going to get painted as more of the same. And I think that's something he's very desperate to avoid politically. And then, of course, also, there are cuts. Yesterday was the deadline for departments to propose cuts that they're going to make up to 15% over the next 3 years. That's going to be in the budget as well, or at least it's expected to be. So, what's that going to look like? Are Canadians going to have to deal with slower services in some cases? Or can these cuts actually be done without impacting Canadians?
Aaron, you can have the final word on this for us. The budget-making exercise, always politically challenging, this time more so perhaps, and economically intense. This is supposed to be Mark Carney's forte. So how do you think about him approaching this?
I think it's a huge task. And I think, what Ryan ended on there, I think is the sort of big looming challenge is the spending review they've launched, and the size of the cuts or reallocations they're looking at are big numbers. And how you make those cuts and where you make them, without causing controversy, I actually, it may be impossible to not cause controversy. And I think that how they handle that spending review could be the story of the fall. And I think, he can make the argument that it's necessary because they need to spend more on defense, they need to spend more on housing, they need to spend more on infrastructure, perhaps. But once you start, picking winners and losers, essentially, which is what happens when you start deciding which programs survive and which don't, you're almost inevitably going to make someone unhappy. And I'm very interested to see how they handle that, both as a practical matter in terms of choosing what they keep and what they cut, and politically how they handle, what will be inevitably criticism and complaints.
Yeah, well, Canadians will be watching, so will all of you and us. Thank you for setting the stage for us. It's good to talk to you all this morning.
Thanks.
Thanks, Susan.
Kathleen Petty is the host of West of Centre podcast and Alberta at Noon. Aaron Wherry is senior reporter in CBC's Parliamentary Bureau, and Ryan Tumilty is a political reporter with the Toronto Star.
You've been listening to The Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.